So, hello everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you virtually at the University of Copenhagen CoMMonS Research Center. My name is Nicole Dörr, and I'm organizing this academic salon or book panel, online book panel on the book, the most important non-human participant in the room, the book Flexible Authoritarianism by Anna Schwenck. Subtitle is Cultivating Ambition and Loyalty in Russia. It's an Oxford University Press book from last year, and it won the Mary Douglas Prize for Best Book in the Sociology of Culture. Congratulations to Anna, the author. And I want to introduce Anna Schwenck and the amazing speakers that are joining us for this book panel, which will take 60 minutes. Anna Schwenck serves as interim professor of sociology at Siegen University. She's an associate researcher at the Siegen Collaborative Research Center Transformations of the Popular and the department. She's also part of the Department of Sociology of Free University of Berlin, the Institute for Eastern European Studies. And Anna has a really broad repertoire of research beyond what the book, this ethnographic book, is presenting. She studies authoritarianism and neoliberalism in Russia, populist tropes and authoritarian beliefs in German popular music cultures and among pandemic skeptics, as well as she studies anti-apartheid liberation song in South African politics today. So she's an expert of musics, visuals, and performative practices, and in a way they restrain or enable cooperation across networks for democracy in flexible authoritarian times. I also proudly introduce Christina Stöckel. Christina Stöckel is full professor of sociology at Luis Guido Cali University in Rome, and she's also a professor at the University of Innsbruck. Professor Stöckel sorry, I was taking out here, is also a political sociologist of religion and world politics and social and political theory. She's a specialist of Russian Orthodoxy and religion-state relations in Russia. For this book panel, it's particularly important that Christina co-authored a new book on the global fight against LGBTI rights with Philip Ayub that came out last year in NYU Press. Congratulations, Christina. Second speaker for today is Maria Brock. Maria is a researcher at the Department of Media and Communication Studies at Södertörn University, and she's the leader of the Baltic Sea Foundation project Network Misogyny in Sweden, Germany, and Russia. She's also the leader of the Marie Curie Horizon 20 project at Malmö University, The Child as a Decipher for a Politics of Traditional Values in the Anti-Gender Movement. This is a comparative study, again, of Russia and Germany. Maria is an expert who's of Russian studies, and she's fluent in German and Russian. And I also proudly introduce Piotr Kuczyba. He's a researcher at Else Frenkel-Brunswick Institute at the University of Leipzig, and he's a specialist of comparative authoritarian grassroots organizing among far-right actors in Germany, Poland, and Hungary. Piotr Kuczyba is also an expert of authoritarian regimes in Central Eastern Europe, and he has an extensive counter-case comparative experience in the field. That said, I want to give the floor to Anna to introduce us into your book. Thank you so much for being here today.
Yes, thanks very much for the kind introduction and the opportunity to present the book. I'm now sharing my screen. We did that before. I hope it's gonna work. Yes, looks good. So just to give you a sense what the book is about, can anyone show me if you can see my screen well?
Yes.
Oh, thank you. So the book is about the interweaving of authoritarian practices and neoliberal techniques. And what is intriguing about the government style that I call flexible authoritarian is that the state employs entrepreneurial incentives to legitimate authoritarian rule. Yet in the book, I'm not only interested in state strategies, I also investigate the subjectivities of young adults who are ambitious and loyal to the Russian state. Here on the picture, you can see an abstraction of the loyal and ambitious young adults I interviewed for the book. A person wearing a suit who holds a smartphone in a devotional manner, like in prayer. And in the background, we see the skyline of the Russian city. And the picture encapsulates these young people's wish to lead what they called a normal life. And to them, this meant to enjoy a living standard similar to that of middle classes in advanced economies. This would include an inspiring job. It would also allow them to continuously develop themselves and their surroundings in a way that feels modern and contemporary. Importantly, they sought to lead such a normal life within Russia. So unlike up-and-coming youth during the 1990s, they found emigration no longer to be an imperative for leading such a normal life. So does the rise of authoritarianism really constitute a backlash to neoliberal globalization? The question seems outdated given current events, yet that was for a long time the literature. And in many cases, already some years ago, authoritarian governments adopt neoliberal flexible policies themselves or continue the neoliberal reforms of their democratic predecessors. And given that Russia is not a textbook example of neoliberalism, let me quickly clarify how I use the term. So by neoliberalism, I mean that states shift the responsibility for their citizens' well-being from the polity or the state to the person. For instance, governments declare that people need to provide on an individual basis for education, for unemployment, accidents, or old age. And this is certainly the case in today's Russia and even in the current war. This neoliberal approach is largely continued, though it changes. So flexible authoritarianism is a governmental approach that incentivizes the neoliberal can-do spirit and thinking outside the box, but it also systematically suppresses dissent and rewards obedience to authority. And the question is, why do authoritarian states need an active citizenry? Why activating these people and jeopardizing the stability of the regime? The sociologist Richard Sennett assigns today's high pressure to remain competitive to what he calls flexible capitalism. And by this, Sennett means the perceived need to quickly adapt to the ever-changing demands of markets. So companies and employees, but also states and their citizens, feel an increasing pressure to prove that they're flexible. States compete for foreign investments and good credit ratings because the well-being of their economies depends on these factors. So these states seek to align their citizen skills with a global capitalist demand for flexibility. So good citizens, and we know that we should be innovative, show initiative, and be happy to work longer hours, even if they are not paid. And motivating citizens to be innovators and entrepreneurs is even more important for emergent economies, such as Russia's or India's. These economies have competitive disadvantages in established markets. And international institutions like the World Bank have recommended for a long time that these economies invest in so-called innovation-based development agendas. And in a very optimistic reading, breakthrough innovations should ensure sustained economic growth. And these could be the car or the smartphone. And as we see now, with more and more pressure being on the European Union and also countries like Canada, these innovation-based development agendas are actually also changing the public discourse in these locations. This is maybe something for the discussion. So many economists find that innovations are more likely to be developed in democratic group atmospheres. And these are characterized by cooperation, contradicting superiors, and experimentation. And all of these qualities sit uneasily with authoritarian values, such as obedience to authority. So what do I mean by authoritarianism? I would say authoritarian practices exist in democracies too, and I think this is important to note. However, in states such as Russia, they are institutionalized. This means that democratic procedures are broken systematically and on a continuous basis. And I think it's very important to still make this differentiation on the level of regime type too. And I take this from Marlies Glasius, who introduced this idea of a sabotage of accountability, which basically means that the media, laws, and voting are designed in a way that ensures re-elections, and that intimidation and coercion are used to suppress public protest. So the question in that setting is, how do these democratic group atmospheres emphasizing cooperation, how are they combined with authoritarian values such as unquestioned respect for established hierarchies? And a good example, I would say, are so-called youth leadership summer camps. And these are idiosyncratic establishments that offer young adults between 18 and 35 years, summer holidays, business education, and trainings to enhance their employability. And so the video is working, but without the sound. While I talk, I just show you some pictures of one of these camps, how they look like. So about 45 of such camps exist in Russia today, as well as in the occupied Ukrainian territories, though not all of them are as fancy as this one, which is one of the oldest ones. It's called Youth That Takes Initiative Birusa. And Birusa exists since 2006, and it takes place annually in Central Siberia. So for some of you, this clip's depiction of Russia might be a bit unexpected. Breakdance and upbeat atmosphere, pictures that remind us of leadership conferences with VIP speakers as we see it right now, and self-development trainers. There's talk of the realization of positive ideas, and one trainer invites campers to love, create, and win. We see this now in the video. So overall, the whole clip, which was commissioned by Russian youth political institutions, revolves around the theme of love. And I hope this was okay to see the video and me talking at the same time. I did this for the first time, so it's been a test. So I hope that the clip illustrates my argument that authoritarian governments such as Russia's skillfully employ the aesthetics of cool startup capitalism and neoliberal techniques to stabilize their rule. And this deployment is intended to serve economic, demographic, and political aims. So one aim is to cultivate ambition among talented youth to become innovative business people, white-collar workers, or scientists. Another aim is to convince such talented youth to stay in the country. And I understand these talented young adults to be what I call potential strategic elites. And by that, I mean people who carry out important functions in a state, for instance, promoting economic growth or scientific advance. And their support for the government is arguably more crucial for regime stability than that of other segments of society. And a third aim is certainly to create loyal citizens who would invest their skills in projects that enhance their career and promote the government's ideals. However, it would be very wrong to assume that authoritarian governments are all powerful and can simply realize those aims. This is where culture actually comes in. Because they do not necessarily succeed in cultivating ambition and loyalty among talented youth. So their propaganda may just not work, or not work as it was intended. So the question is, what upholds regimes symbolically and socially. So I argue that people's loyalty is as much shaped by official speeches as they are by cultural understandings. And by that, I mean understandings that are shaped by received wisdom from popular culture. They can be entailed in stories that are told at family gatherings, one's workplace, or at summer camps. In all these situations, cultural understandings are crucial for communication and meaning making. And where some understandings might be locally specific and not understood by outsiders, others might be transnationally shared. And such cultural understandings may justify a flexible authoritarianism beyond a small circle of ruling elites. And I investigated the cultural understandings potential strategic elites invoked when they explained why they are loyal to the state during interviews with me. So a few questions that were guiding my research: which cultural understandings justify flexible authoritarianism in the eyes of these young people? How did often unquestioned beliefs figure in their stories and influence their expectations towards themselves, their fellow citizens, but also expectations towards the state? And how do public stories and cultural forms, one such cultural form I analyze is the summer camp tradition, stabilize the regime? And by regime, I mean the underlying order of political and economic life. So because I have only 10 minutes, I'm already at the summary and outlook. So I tried to make some concluding remarks that also point to possible themes for discussion. So what the book offers is a cultural perspective on authoritarianism, and I argue that it facilitates a more nuanced understanding of the texture of loyalty. And with regard to today's Russia, I would say this texture is one in which criticism and support are actually tightly interwoven. Cultural understandings that legitimate authoritarianism are not confined by the borders of nation states. This is another important argument I make in the book. So there might be those locally specific ones that only exist within this kind of Russian cultural sphere, if you want to name it like that, but others, and especially those that I have designated as neoliberal, circulate transnationally. And one example is the classification of people in deserving and undeserving types. And according to the young campers I interviewed, deserving people were those that would show initiative and they would deserve respect and welfare, whereas people who could be suspected to be passive or lazy did not deserve such respect or support. And we know these kinds of classifications from many countries around the world, and I think the US is also an important example here. So I contend that these young people's loyalty was not animated by a deep desire to regain a great power status for Russia. There are these peoples, but there are these young people, but this is not the people I met at these camps. Instead, I argue that these potential strategic elites' complicity with the authoritarian state is created through their ambitious desires for upward mobility or their fears of downward mobility. I think both are two sides of the same coin, actually. And by the dream to work in creative industries and lead a normal life and have a convenient life. So this is more what I found, and not so much like I'm from Russia and I have this great power complex. So finally, I would say that we deal here with neoliberal techniques and their aesthetics usage for authoritarian ends. And I would say we can detect comparable tendencies in many countries where this kind of strongman rules is on the rise. And I think future research could build on this book and look more specifically at how this is actually different in other countries. Because something I also argue in the book is that young people are drawn to these camps because these neoliberal techniques are something new to them. And they are also drawn to that because they're not used to be spoken with in a way where they feel as equals. and all these kind of business startup techniques. It's something that is very close to what we could say democratic group cultures. But this might be, and it probably is, very, very different in other countries, where this differentiation between what you experience at the university or in school and at these kind of forums is much more similar. So I would end here and leave some more points I have for the discussion. Very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Anna. This is a great, great book. And I want to ask our speakers to comment on it. And I want to ask Christina Stackel to start in discussing the book. So is this book helpful for your work, Christina, in terms of Russia, where Russia is today? Come on, there's a lot to say. What do you
Yes, it's a super helpful book. It's an excellent book. I really, if you haven't read it yet, you should definitely read it. Also, if you're not interested in Russia, but I really think that the story that Anna tells in that book goes much beyond the Russian example. So the idea that authoritarian politics and neoliberalism can merge and mutually reinforce each other is a reality that we see also in many Western European countries. So really, first of all, congratulations to Anna for the book, but also thank you for the book, because I think it's really important we have that now. And to a certain extent, I wish maybe I would have had it already when I did my research on what I called the moral conservative norm entrepreneurs. So we meet on that word, the entrepreneurs. And the entrepreneurial type that you describe so vividly in many of the interviews that you do and in the vignettes where you describe these camps felt very familiar to me, because I met several of these entrepreneurial types, the religious entrepreneurs. So those actors inside Russia who created civil society organizations, NGOs, for the support of traditional family, to dissuade women from having abortions, to create shelter homes for women so they wouldn't go have an abortion, but they'd go carry the child. Creating, for example, an all-Russian homeschooling network that was really a business model, because then this homeschooling material was like a startup, was also being translated in Russian and sold on the internet. So and they were making money with it. And so we did lots of interviews as well with these entrepreneurial types. And one thing that I noticed, or what was kind of recurrent, is that often these entrepreneurial types, they actually had a narrative, they had a story of religious awakening. So because they were actually, religious entrepreneurs, there was also this moment of conversion for type of, before I was not religious, but then I discovered that I discovered God and religion, or before I was, single and I only thought about my career, but then I discovered the value of family. So this idea of self-discipline, in a way that also happens through something that comes from outside, and that makes you in a way, bring about a positive change for yourself. I think that's also very close to what you describe in your book, because you start the book with this, I think it's one of the chapters with this statement on, well, the biggest problem of Russia is laziness. So this idea that, that there needs to be a work ethic, a discipline. That's the person didn't use religious language, but they could very well have used it. But what I want to draw your attention to is that this idea of a Christian work ethic being sort of against laziness and being, first of all, about disciplining yourself and being a good individual, and that will then trickle down into society. I know you described that really clearly. That is actually very much at home in a Protestant evangelical individual salvation type of work ethic and Christian ethics. So it's a religious model that isn't actually that close to an Orthodox religious model of salvation. The Orthodox religious model of salvation goes through contemplation. So the privileged pathway to salvation is to become a monk or to become a nun, to have a consecrated life and to pray. And in Protestantism, where we do not have congregational life of that type, and it's actually the family that becomes the place of salvation. And so this hyper focus on the family, which also means that then the members of the family, you see yourself kind of as an entrepreneur of yourself, but then also your little business is the family, kind of. I see a lot of parallels in a way in the mindset that you describe. Maybe the people you were interviewing, they were still sort of below the age level of before they were creating families. But imagine, if these people go on to create families, how they will approach, with what will the mindset be? And I see that it would seamlessly flow into this very important pillar of the Russian traditional values discourse on the family. We support families, against gay Europe. You also have that excellent chapter on gay Europa. And I happened to do my fieldwork at the same time when Conchita Wurst, the Austrian drag queen, won the Eurovision Song Contest, and it was all over Russia. It was like it became such an image that was being used and reused in order to sort of describe themselves as opposed to that. So the last.
Yes. Go ahead, good.
Yeah, just one short point, and that's actually now a question, because I think what we see here is really a very different form of civil society. We always associated civil society with, progress, critique, a counterweight to government. And here we see a civil society being created top-down that is seen as a pillar of the government. And this is in a way, I think, in contrast to what other Russian scholars tell us about Russian society. I'm here specifically thinking about Greg Yudin, the sociologist who says Russian society is depoliticized. The state has worked all these years to depoliticize Russian societies. Russians do not feel they can change anything. They think politics is ugly, is dirty. It's Russia. So Russian society is depoliticized. But then at the same time, you've given this excellent example of Russian society being built as a civil society being built top down by the state. So my question to you would be, what do you think about this depoliticization trope, whether that it really explains what's happening? So thank you.
Thank you, Christina. Anna, is it okay if I take the more reviewers and then you answer to all of them? Okay, great. So now we have been talking about the family already, and I wanted to ask Maria Brock from Södertörn to come in. Maria, you are also looking at the fusion of some of the flexible authoritarian techniques to Western Europe and especially to Germany and Sweden. What can you do with this book and for your own work?
Wow, good question. But super quickly, I wanted to thank you, Nicole, for inviting me, and also Anna for writing the book. So I read the book thanks to this invitation, and so you're watching me digest basically what is happening live. When Christina was talking, I was holding up. I've actually got both of the books that were mentioned, so I feel quite lucky in terms of how can I apply this to my own work. First of all, I mean, this is just a short point, but I'm spending a lot of time when I'm writing about, I'm trying to write about Russia, Germany, and Sweden as one. And so I often have to spend a lot of time just justifying how can we even talk about them, in any kind of, I resist the word comparative framework, but in any kind of contextual conversation. And I find Anna's focus on technique rather than characterizing a specific kind of regime, hybrid or autocratic, but just to focus on the kind of flexible authoritarian techniques that are employed and trying to identify those. I find that really useful, and I think that's going to generate a lot of, hopefully for myself as well, like fertile thinking, maybe thinking about what are the kind of techniques employed in different contexts in terms of, so Nicole, your question was about the family, and you hinted at that. In my previous and still current research, I was looking at how the child becomes a kind of symbol or signifier that is operationalized by different types of, let's say, regimes, systems, in order to justify specific illiberal advancements. Another word we haven't used yet, illiberal regimes, I guess, is another one that's becoming popular. And so I found what Christina just said quite helpful as well. So when we look at, say, in Germany and Sweden, right-wing or anti-gender initiatives that say that the child, or the way that the child is being taught, educated, and raised through state education systems is too interventionist, and it should return to the kind of hearth of the family, so that there's only safety in the family. That is actually very much in line with the kind of traditional values discourse that's in place in Russia. And while the word salvation isn't being used, I think, again, there's the techniques that are being employed are both neoliberal in terms of kind of rolling back the state. The family, the individual, is responsible for themselves and for the family. But at the same time, there is a kind of religious notion, and I know, Anna, you didn't talk much about religion, but there is a kind of religious notion around kind of what is deemed natural, what is deemed traditional, what is the nature of salvation. And of course, Christianity and kind of Christian values, whether openly avowed or just kind of implied in more Western context, are very much behind these ideas around gender and what the child needs, or even what is sacred and innocent. So this kind of idea of sacredness is something that I encounter. And again, there's a kind of combination of this neoliberal, almost entrepreneurial spirit, so optimizing the family, optimizing family structures and what your child will be in a competitive capitalist society, but at the same time adhering to traditional neoconservative ideas, moral ideas around, what a family should look like and what a child is and how a child should be raised. But I don't know if I'm moving.
This is really interesting. And so the question is so much about all of that in Russia after socialism and after post-socialism. And so one thing, thank you so much, Maria, what Anna said is that you think it's different in other countries. So talking about these things from an economic perspective, I want to ask Piotr Koczyba from University of Leipzig to come in. So you are an expert not only of Poland, where the family and the kind of a flexible authoritarian mobilization of it is really strong, but also of Hungary. In one of these countries, the authoritarianism and in the other one, it persists. What is your take on the book, Flexible Authoritarianism, and what's your research perspective on these topics?
Can you hear me?
Perfect.
Great. Yes, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to this book discussion. And Anna, thank you so much for your book. It helps me a lot to understand what I am trying to research. And maybe, Nicole, you have already said that I am working on far-right movements, especially in Poland and Eastern Germany. But I'm also conducting ethnographical research on, I cannot really tell the name because I'm still in the middle of the research process, but on a hybrid educational institution, which is very close to the government in Hungary, to the Fidesz. And I will share something which will for surely like in the chat, just to show the techniques which are very similar. I can say maybe a little bit about this link in a couple of minutes. And what I'm observing is exactly, Anna, what you are describing as flexible authoritarianism. So similar to your findings, what I can see both on the grassroots in Poland and in Eastern Germany, but also among this, privileged intellectuals in Hungary, it has very much to do with this promise of economical success if you play along the game. There's a very well situated citizens, business owners, tech professionals, or young people who are trying to ensure their well-being, their economical well-being. And this is very important, I think, for the debate in Germany about Eastern Germany. There are by far not losers of globalization, the people who I'm conducting research with. And these actors are combining entrepreneurial mindsets, like you have described them, self-optimization, personal responsibility, combined with a deep distrust of a distributing state and with strong authoritarian leanings. So these are people who are really asking for order, security, for protection of their economical privileged position, and they do it really willingly. And this is, yeah, like I said, true for those who are privileged in the Hungarian case, but also it's true for this far-right movements. For example, I'm now, since a couple of years, spending a lot of time on the Saxon Monday demonstrations, which started during the pandemic and which are organized every Monday until now, sometimes or each Monday mobilizing even in smaller towns up to a couple of hundred protesters. And what is fascinating, this core of the protesters, which are still on the streets there are mainly there are mainly people who are running businesses, doing economically very well, opposing big government, liberal democratic institutions, and advocating instead, for this authoritarian conservative policies. So there are no losers of globalization, or like say in Central and Eastern Europe, losers of transformation. And it is surely not a backlash against the neoliberal capitalism, but on the contrary, what I am observing is a deep-seated disappointment with the current state of liberalism and this desire for an utterly competitive society in which these actors believe that they would be rewarded in their personal being well-being, economically being well off. So flexible authoritarianism merges this neoliberal self-reliance with demands for a very strong hierarchical political order. And like you wrote in your book, these are actors who are attracted to this combination of personal autonomy in business combined with the promise of economical wealth and with a submission to authoritarian political authority. And I think, especially if you look at the link we are having here the techniques which are copied. This is a Summerfest, which is organized, I think, since 4 years. And if you look at the images, at the videos also on Facebook, which are posted, Anna, it's exactly a copy paste, this Belarusia, which you have shown us. So yes, Maria, you're totally right. It's not so much about terms, how to phrase it, hybrid or I don't know, illiberal or far right or whatsoever, but we should very much look at this techniques which are used and the cultural understandings, and especially also at this transnational level. Yeah, I tried to be short.
Thank you very much. Anna, you want to respond, or shall we have a second round of questions?
Maybe I respond to the question that was posed by Christina. I think there were no direct questions by Piotr and Maria, right? But you just rephrase it. I might have missed it while writing down. So Christina's question was the one about civil society research, and there is like a strong discourse among scholars of Russia that ordinary Russian people, it's a weird term, but that's the one that is used, that they would be depoliticized, passive, And in a way, this kind of research is kind of a mirror image of, I don't know, Marjorie Howard's civil society in Russia, where they kind of say, okay, the people who participate in association, it's really low. It's kind of post-communist civil society has this problem. We have a similar discourse on Poland. Piotr, you might know that much better. So in a way, this is a mirror image, and I would say the problem with the depoliticization discourse is the question of the frame we use for analysis. Because I would say, yes, we see very active people here. And I think this would also second what you find in your book, Christina, about these very active people and norm entrepreneurs and conservative entrepreneurs. And I call them in the book co-creators of a government-sponsored civic life. So actually, I felt that the authoritarian state is actually functioning a bit like a social media platform. So they're providing platforms where you then can participate as a citizen. So it's a bit like YouTube. So it kind of incentivizes that you upload things, that you become a creator yourself. But as the same problem we have with the platforms or Facebook is that you cannot change the rules of the game, right? We cannot change how the platform works. And I think a similar thing we can see in authoritarian states, and it would be interesting whether this also applies to Hungary, as Piotr says. And so, for instance, what Greg Yudin says about the depoliticization, I would say if we take the frame of how does opposition to authoritarian politics emerge, the question is whether this kind of being busy and in the bus and doing things and this whole ideology of if I change myself, and this might be a Protestant one, right? To have the trickle-down effect and this changes society. Whether this is not a constellation that depoliticizes in the sense of it prevents people from making systemic critique, of seeing the problem we have is not that my neighbor is not bringing out the trash. The problem is basically that we don't have infrastructures anymore for collecting the trash. And why don't we have these infrastructures? Because we have a lot of what people would call corruption. But where does the corruption come from? So these kinds of questions, and in the political science, we have the term of cooptation, they are kind of sidelined. So I would say, yes, there is a kind of depoliticization on that level of the analysis, but I wouldn't side with these analyses in terms of that people do not care what happens around them, that they just retreat to a private life. I would say yes, and maybe this might now be in the war very much more the case because there is so much fear and so much persecution. But still, people have been very critical about what was going on. So this is directly to Christina. And then I want to say one sentence about Hungary, because actually while I wrote the book, and that was after the field research, I was in a project together with Hungarian scholars who researched the use of music in Hungary. So this also very much actually influenced my decision to use a more of a comparative lens also, and here and there also look at what is actually happening in Hungary. And Maria, maybe can you just restate your question? Sorry that I didn't get it. Maybe.
Anna, thank you so much.
I don't think I asked a question.
So just one thing, people from the audience, if you want to ask something, raise your hand or just put your name in the text, because we'll have 15 minutes left. So Maria, you wanted to say something on queer politics and the relevance of the book also, in that regard.
I don't know if I necessarily wanted to say something apart from that. yeah, I mean, not only do you talk about masculinity and kind of traditional masculinity and how that can be, I always do this traditional masculinity and how this is being operationalized in the service of, again, quasi flexible authoritarian regimes. And again, that just struck me as incredibly useful for what I'm trying to do. I mean, my new project is actually looking at traditional values as they're being promulgated by women in the service of far-right projects, or at least neoconservative projects. And I find that there's so these projects, I should say, are tendentially or almost always anti-queer and anti-feminist. Even more overtly than what I've been looking at before. But they make offer an interesting take on entrepreneurialism and kind of neoliberal techniques using, for example, social media. I mean, you talked about social media in a different context, but sometimes it's young men who are sort of pursuing paths of traditional hegemonic masculinity while also espousing the sort of cult of the entrepreneur. But we've also got trad wives or Christian Orthodox influences in Russia that are, in a way, entrepreneurs. They're entrepreneurs of the self and of the lifestyles that they represent. They represent achievement while espousing ostensibly traditional, even spiritual values. So I just found that's a further development of this kind of these cultural techniques that you're describing in the age of social media and in the age of the self becoming a kind of unit of capital. But I don't want to bombard this discussion because I think some hands have come up now, Anna.
Thank you so much, Maria. So I'll ask Ulrike Vlade, Christina. Where is Christina?
She's there. We can see
I'm here.
the fusion of this phenomenon. Because Christina, you have this book on the anti-trans and anti-LGBT mobilization and Russian conservatives role. Do you see that what Anna is showing is being diffused internationally in your research?
Yes, I'm actually wondering, it's a bit of a chicken and egg question, what diffuses first? Because, so to my mind, I think the kind of moral conservative transnational, the moralist international that we, as we call it, very much relies on those types of techniques that Anna describes. And in fact, when I called them global or moral norm entrepreneurs, it was because they have this entrepreneurial spirit. And that also makes them very, flexible across nations, across languages, across religious contexts. That's what I was hinting at before with the salvation thing, which maybe is better, puzzled you a bit, but things that work, across an Orthodox, a Catholic, a Protestant context, that work maybe in Latin America, just as they work in the US, just as they work is in Russia. That is, so I think to a certain extent, if anything, the kind of research we did on the transnationalization could enhance sort of the point made by Anna in the book, namely that this is not only a Russian phenomenon. And you don't necessarily even need to go and look for youth camps somewhere. I think that there can be many other settings, and churches could be such a setting, for example, conversion scenarios. I mean, I'm speaking as a sociologist of religion here, where you would see similar things taking place. Now, our approach in the book, and I'll also show the book, was a social movement approach. So we basically looked at social movements and movement leaders, and we mapped movement leaders basically, and which, by the way, is also what I really like about Anna's book, is that she talks to movement members, to the grassroots, so to speak, of those movements, because that's another thing which we didn't do in our book, talking only to the leaders, not to the people who actually attend. It would be interesting to see whether talking to people who attend these events, that actually matches the kind of mindset that Anna describes, the story, the narratives that she describes.
Thank you, Christina. Anna, you will respond, and then we have potentially 2 more questions.
Okay, perfect. So I start answering Simon's question because I can you see this? Because you asked.
Yes, perfect.
So this is actually saying active, passive, pro-government, anti-government. And this kind of graph has been drawn by a local youth political minister in Siberia. And he showed this to me to explain me during our interview what the youth politics is about. So basically he said, okay, we want all the youth to become active and pro-government. So we get rid of the passive ones. So they should all come up here. And so the ones who are already active, but a kind of anti-government, we also want to get them in this part of the drawing. And then he was a bit skeptical how they can actually get the passive and anti-government ones. So actually the Hope for Democracy are actually the most passive people probably who are also anti-government, to make a joke. So I think and then in broader terms how dissent is thought about, I would say that I mean, institutionalized authoritarianism works very much by creating an atmosphere of uncertainty. That means with one foot, you're always in prison because you never know, because there's so much overlapping laws and things, you never know what's going to happen. And I think this is very much how power is created in these settings, and why I would say, yes, there is a difference. If I go on a strike in Germany, I mean, yes, for sure. If I have much more money, I can have much better lawyers, and all these kinds of things apply. But still, there is something in place like a rule of law. And this kind of creation of uncertainty makes it also very volatile, what actually dissent is. So what can happen is that the state doesn't even have a very, it has a kind of a gelatine-like understanding of dissent. So as long as someone is helpful in one way for a government aim, the person cannot be persecuted at all, even though the person is dissenting. And for a long time, like media like Echo Moskwy, which is a kind of liberal media, this was kind of helpful for, I don't know, creating an image or whatever. So these people were kept. So I think there is not a real answer to that question, because it's also, and this reminds me of the first question of the soft authoritarianism and how my concept relates to that. So I think this is used, but I think what is very important to keep in mind is this deliberate production of uncertainty while creating the appearance of a law and order state where everything goes by the rules. And actually, I mean, we have this misunderstanding of authoritarian states being very accurate. I hope it's still kind of in line with historical research on National Socialism, but we had that there too, right? That you would say just because people march kind of in lines, everything was in law and order, but no, it was actually all over the place. So this is about that question. And then my understanding of flexibility and where it comes from. So I use the term actually because there is a large literature called authoritarian neoliberalism, and they have a bit of another take on what that means than I have. So I wanted, because my argument is slightly different, but I won't say in which ways because it's taking up too much time. So I wanted to use a different term. And I found the flexibilization, this idea is so interesting, not so much because of that rules are applied in a flexible way, yes. Yeah, it would also speak to that theme of uncertainty, but actually coming from what happened in the economic sphere across countries. And this is the flexibilization. And in Germany, we have this term, or in the German-speaking countries, of Standortwettbewerb. And I think that this kind of competition for being the best place to invite foreign direct investment has been very important in many ways. And where I come from is actually a kind of German language sociology on authoritarianism that is not so much political science-y in that it takes capitalism into account. And Wilhelm Heidmeier is probably the name who has kind of brought this idea, okay, we also need to analyze capitalism in order to understand authoritarian waves. So I think I would leave it here. And then for sure, there is something like the soft techniques. So when you really want to work with the kind of language, you could make connections. But for me, it was really to say, okay, there is this link between capitalism and the capitalist structure. And a kind of authoritarian politics. And also to say, because I analyzed Schumpeter, and this revival of Schumpeter also in the first chapter, to say, okay, there are so many authoritarian values also in how capitalism is understood. Not for everyone, but in many ways. And for Schumpeter, it was just that. You had like the geniuses, these were the innovators, and you had the people who had to do the routine tasks. And he was actually saying, okay, how can we do that? How can we make people to execute these routine tasks? No one wants to do it. So don't tell them anything about democracy. It's not for them. Democracy is only for the geniuses. And I think part of that we see also happening in Russia today, where and this is why I would say I did not necessarily speak to the kind of working class, because these people are the people who are sent to the front now. They're the fodder in the war, and there is also like a class distinction between the innovators and those who are kind of the foot soldiers. So yeah, maybe I stop here.
Thank you very much, Anna. So we're over time. Birte, you have a question?
1990s, majority of the population was impoverished. All the kind of life chances evaporated basically in the 1990s. And so this idea was, okay, the 1990s was the birth of egoism, and people just started to be egoistic very much. So through the kind of patriotism and the civilizational nationalism, it's not an ethnic nationalism. Putinist nationalism is a civilizational nationalism. There is this idea with the trickle-down effect. I do something for my country by becoming an entrepreneur, paying taxes, making this, I don't know, part of Siberia into a dazzling center that looks like Silicon Valley. I invent this kind of breakthrough innovation. It will be produced here, change the market, and thereby I also do something for my country. So there's a very nationalist discourse in that. I think that's important. And maybe one last thing I want to say, because I'm just reading the latest book by Marion Folkate. It's called The Ordinal Society. And it's on, it's basically an economic sociology and on tech. And what I find interesting is how, when we think about these developments, and if we take seriously what Maria said about the regime types, and whether the regime types are always helpful for our thinking and analysis. And also I want to read your kind of comparisons, Maria. I was thinking of what is happening now also in the still democratic blocs and countries we have, like in the EU, with this kind of pressure to succeed and this crazy new kind of competition in this changing world, and whether we might see similar practices as the ones we have analyzed by different actors, by state actors, but also by conservative actors. And the idea is that maybe there is a new constellation where kind of we see a reconfiguration of participation or participatory practices in order to support kind of a state mindset, to support the kind of militarization. And just an example, I don't know who's familiar with the kind of advertisement for the German army. It says, "Do you want to become an explorer?" And it's basically an advertisement for becoming a soldier, but it looks like an outdoor catalog page where you have like a van and a tent on it, and you have kind of gadgets. So we can see these similar techniques. This is not to say that there is now this, I don't know, authoritarianism in Germany. No, there is a huge difference still. But I think when we take this seriously, what Maria said, to look at the practices and the similarities on that level, without making the mistake to say there's everything the same everywhere in the world, we can see that this will be used also because it's something. And this is just, I start thinking about it because I'm just reading, I show you the book. No, I don't show it. Shouldn't make too much advertisement. Because this works so well with the social media sphere. I think this and when you think about the German elections and how everyone said, yeah, the left party, young people only voted for the left party because they were big on TikTok. So this idea that through these techniques, we can actually channel people very well. Yeah, I would be interested in how that is used also to actually not suppress dissent in this old kind of way of thinking with police, but to kind of channel dissent into a more active, more pro-state, more whatever way. And in some ways, this might be something we are not against, because on the general ideological line, we might say, but this is something we need. But I think on a deeper level, the question would be, what does that actually mean for democracy if the state starts using such, in a way, even manipulative techniques to create a kind of consent? Yeah, so maybe I stop here.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Anna Schwenck. So where's the hope? So Piotr was not making his point on Poland, how they were able to get out of it yet, but you want to make that in one sentence? How did Poland tackle flag, or they didn't?
Okay, one sentence.
Yes.
Okay, before I put out the sentence, I have to warn you, I am Polish, so I'm allowed to be kitschy. To put it very simple, we have to use an old solidarity slogan, which is mostly forgotten, and it says simply, there is no freedom without solidarity. What we have seen is that different social actors were cooperating, building up dense networks, supporting each other, and only through this cooperation and networking, beyond ideological, differences, especially, I'm not talking about parties, but especially within the civil society sphere, social movements, it was possible to get rid of this ugly authoritarian government after 2 legislative terms, which is simply a miracle again.
It is. And it's a very important miracle, especially given we are now in the second Trump presidency. For our American friends, Anna, your book is amazing. It's very concerning. I found the most interesting passage that you were taken as a German spy. As a red line in one of the chapters, I'm bowing in front of you for the first chapter. I was so completely astonished that you're a grand theorist on these topics. People, you must read this. I hope that many will share the video. Thank you so much for today and for talking about your book. Thank you for the speakers, for joining us, the experts, and also the experts in the audience.